Gino Boccasile was born in the southeastern Italian city of Bari in 1901, the son of a perfume maker. In his childhood, an accident led to the loss of sight in his left eye, but this didn't prevent him from pursuing his interest in drawing and painting, and he went on to study at the city's art school. Following the unexpected death of his father in 1925, Boccasile relocated to Milan, where he managed to secure a job with the prestigious Mosan Morsenti advertising agency. And over the coming years he created posters for all manner of clients, although the evidence from this time shows he had yet to find his own definitive stylistic approach. During this period he spent time at the company's offices in Buenos Aires and briefly in Paris, and Boccasile used his time with the company to improve and refine his illustration techniques and understanding of the way all aspects of the advertising industry worked. While working in Buenos Aires he met Alma Corsi, who he would later marry, and when he returned to Milan in 1932 he left Mosan Morsenti and set up his own advertising agency, Acta, where he began to put all his skills and knowledge he had acquired to profitable use. His work for the agency continued to be quite diverse and retained some of the more Art Deco elements he had previously exploited, but a more painterly figurative style clearly and rapidly began to dominate the posters he was now creating as the decade progressed. And just as frequently he demonstrated a fondness for diagonal placing of the figure, a device guaranteed to imbue the image with dynamism and energy. In addition to his productivity as a poster artist and commitment to the advertising business, Boccasile also branched out into book cover illustration, including an extensive series of popular swashbuckling historical romances for the publishers Periodici Mondadori. From this point onward, virtually all his posters made considerable creative use of the depiction of the human figure, and although it wasn't exclusively the case, it was most frequently and predominantly the portrayal of attractive females which served as the focus of his images. But there continued to be departures from this with surreal comedy elements and continued, if by now infrequent, more abstracted designs. According to auction houses selling his original artwork, his paintings were created in either gouache or tempera, on cardboard, and the limited available evidence suggests that he created the rougher maquettes used to show the client for approval using gouache, and then painted the finished art in tempera. Again, it's guesswork on my part, but it looks very much like he was using an airbrush for some of his work. But whatever the case, he used his skills to achieve plausible tonal and textural effects. Boccasile's client base was as impressive as it was diverse, with work for insurance companies celebrating Italy's profitable colonialism, and he also created a particularly dynamic series featuring athletic young men representing Italy in 1936's Berlin Olympic Games. And although he continued to produce other images of considerable visual appeal and occasional visual wit, it was undoubtedly his facility with the female figure which evidently had clients queuing up to commission him. Many of these were actually aimed at women, and like women's magazines, traded on their predilection for glamour and beauty. There continued to be other aspects to his graphic approach and subject matter, with occasional returns to the Art Deco styling he'd begun his career with. But in the second half of the decade these were few and far between, and it was his relentlessly cheerful ladies, sometimes accompanied by equally cheerful babies, which defined his output. Obviously working from the principle that if something isn't broke you should not attempt to fix it, by this time it seemed not to matter one bit what the product being advertised was. From holiday destinations to domestic appliances, a Boccasile girl was a virtual guarantee of popular success. And in 1938 he capitalised again on his popularity in this regard, with some cheery and quite demure and lightly humorous duotone pin-ups for the magazine Il Grandi Femme. And as the decade drew to a close, his ubiquitous upbeat illustrations of attractive women gave no indication whatsoever of the political and social turmoil and increasing violence that defined the period. Benito Mussolini's fascist party had been the government of Italy since 1922, and Boccasile had very early on become an enthusiastic supporter. But I found no overtly propagandist work by him until 1940, the year in which Italy threw in their lot with Hitler's Germany against the Allies. Early on in the conflict, he confined himself to the production of patriotic posters in praise of the valiant young men who were tasked with securing an Italian victory. And despite the country being embroiled in what by now had become a war on a global scale, the bulk of his posters continued to be quite innocuous, upbeat and commercial in nature. But the first real sign of more vitriolic imagery came with this admittedly stunning 1940 depiction of the fate awaiting London, courtesy of the might of the Axis. And in 1941 it was followed by another showing a demonic John Bull character having his fans extracted by German and Italian soldiers. In the same year he celebrated Japan's entry into the war with this image of a giant samurai hacking Allied ships to bits. The juxtaposition of these images next to his ongoing commercial work featuring cheerful Italian housewives was particularly jarring, but in 1942 it seems he devoted himself exclusively to propaganda, which became increasingly hysterical and unpleasant. All the Allied forces and their supposed Jewish puppet masters came in for similar visual scorn, and as a counterbalance he also created rosy portraits of their heroic German friends. When the Allies occupied Sicily in 1943, Mussolini was dismissed from office and placed under arrest by his successor Pietro Badoglio. But with help from Germany he was rescued and subsequently set up the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, with support from Boccasile among other more fanatical supporters. He not only remained loyal to the fascist cause but became even more involved in its activities, and having enlisted in the Italian SS division, he created recruitment posters for them and increasingly maniacal images of the enemy in his propaganda work. Among other disturbing but graphically eloquent paintings created at this time, his posters aimed at demonising the USA used the image of a black GI, presumably his blackness somehow making the insult to Italy's faith and heritage even worse, with the desecration and looting of the country's treasures. Even when it was obvious to all except the most rabidly fanatical that Italy would soon be defeated, Boccasile continued to be a virtual one-man propaganda machine and continued to paint Italy's cause as heroic and the Allies an evil pestilence. But following the Italian defeat and death of Mussolini in 1945, Boccasile was imprisoned for his role during the war, and he was tried as a leading fascist and SS member. But he was fortunate enough to not be considered worth sentencing and was duly acquitted. Unsurprisingly, as an unwelcome reminder of Italy's role in the war, he struggled to find anyone willing to give him work directly after the war had ended. But despite his all too brief ostracisation, by late 1946 he was back at the drawing board and producing posters once more, and it was as though the war had never happened. He even set up his own advertising agency in Milan again, and quicker than expected, he increasingly enjoyed success with a range of mainstream clients, all of whom appear to have been happy to turn a blind eye to his wartime excesses. The abundant visual evidence from this period shows that he continued to exploit the same winning formula he'd established before the war, with a preponderance of female loveliness, including this rather dreamy pin-up, which also existed in a more demure covered-up version after presumably falling foul of the censors. And by 1950 he was also working for magazines again, appearing regularly in the racy French magazine Taboo, using two of his most stalwart enduring generic characters, the provocative young lady and the cheeky miscreant child. And chubby youngsters were every bit as prevalent in his later output as the pin-up style females, and were used with considerable success for posters advertising to young mothers. The reinvented Boccasile and his advertising business were by the early 1950s arguably even more successful than before the war. And just as he had done previously, he carried on creating high-quality painted renders possessed of a cheerful humanity that had been totally absent during the war. I've been unable to find anything other than Boccasile's own posters as evidence of his agency's work, and they are all manifestly painted by him and signed as such. So whether it was a particularly small business operating simply to support his prodigious output, I really don't know. But even if it was just him and a couple of administrative workers, the evidence of his posters clearly shows that in Italian terms at least, his client base consisted of major national businesses who relied on him to present them in a very favourable light. Whether he used amusing little scamps, lovely ladies, or just generally lively upbeat scenarios to entice and ensnare the consumers, there was no denying their impact and ubiquitous dominance in Italian towns and cities. It could be said that he'd been extremely fortunate to have been able to find his way back into popular favour and considerable financial success, given his deplorable wartime behaviour. But out of nowhere his good fortune ran out. And in 1952, just as everything was going his way, he fell seriously ill with a combination of bronchitis and pleurisy, and died soon after at the age of only 51. Following his death, it came to light that in addition to the remarkable volume of advertising work he'd been creating, he had also been hard at work on an illustrated edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century. The paintings he had managed to complete before his death were eventually published as a book in 1955, and I have no idea how well it was received by the public or the critics. But the book undoubtedly contains some of his finest work, and as a body of narrative literary illustration, it was mercifully free of any unpleasant ideological claptrap, or for that matter purely commercial function. Which by no means excuses him for his strident propaganda in support of the losing team, and although Boccasile was far from the only Italian illustrator of his time to be seduced by fascist ideology, he remains probably the most notorious due to the graphic, vitriolic nature of the majority of these posters. Nevertheless, I'd still rather end on a more upbeat note. So here's a collection of a few more of Boccasile's less reprehensible images that I couldn't make room for earlier, to remember him by.